Hi there, welcome back to On the Flip Side. My name is Adam Shawwalker, and today we're going to be covering the third D.R.I. record, 1987's Crossover. This monumental record, for its time and for its genre, was one of the first labeled as crossover, hence the title, the crossover between thrash metal and hardcore punk. D.R.I. is a band from Texas, although most hardcore punk at the time was probably coming out of like New York and that general area, but there was a scene in Texas that was releasing hardcore punk as well. Most notably to come out of there, probably D.R.I. I picked this album most notably because I have owned this record for like a handful of years, 4 or 5 years maybe. I picked it up for like $10 years ago. And I have been considering covering this record mostly because of the fact that I've listened to it like maybe twice while owning it, and I've never been the biggest fan of hardcore like crossover thrash punk. Really, the furthest I'll go into this genre is stuff like Municipal Waste and maybe like, I mean, Toxic Holocaust is closer to like pure thrash nowadays, but it has a lot of the same punk influences. But it's just one of those genres that I don't climb into that much because I have a weird thing about thrash and how it's either really, really good or it is just utter garbage. And you can notice that like on a lot of thrash bands, like from the early 80s, you have like the Big Four and all that, and then you have like the early punk bands that are, you know, the most notable in my opinion are like the Dead Kennedys, The Clash, and Black Flag, and those being my favorite punk bands. And I don't really listen to much else punk other than those bands. I mean, you know, the Dicks are pretty good, D.R.I. is not bad, but I mean, there's a lot of bands that I just haven't given a lot of time because thrash metal tends to do the opposite of rewarding innovation, and they tend to stagnate a bit. So thrash as a genre, I think, has been very dead in the water for a very long time, and that includes punk in a lot of ways because punk really thrives off of youth. When you get these younger bands doing these older ideas, they are very much limited by their own genres, so you don't get a lot of reinvention, and there's not really too much of a reason to visit many of these newer albums, or most of the older albums too, because a lot of the time you're going to get some very samey stuff except from like the most notable names in those genres. Hence why, honestly, if you just listen to the Big Four and not very many other thrash metal bands, I really can't blame you. Like, Exodus is pretty good, Death Angel is pretty good. There's some really good stuff you'll find in those genres, but for the most part, modern thrash metal and modern punk are very much dead in the water. So I wanted to go and look at this album and see if I could find, you know, what's really, you know, what could tickle me on this record as compared to something a bit newer or something even older of the same time period. I mean, you know, I love the first Suicidal Tendencies record. That's a great album, and it's a more of this like crossover style thrash punk, but with I think a bit more thrash rather than punk, and I think this is more punk rather than thrash in that same vein. So the track listing is as follows. You have side 1 with The 5-Year Plan, Tear It Down, A Coffin, Probation, IDKY, and Decisions. Side 2 is Hooked, Go Die, Redline, No Religion, Fun and Games, and Oblivion. So we are going to listen to side 1 of the record, come back to you on the flip side, and we'll go through them then. Alrighty, so we are done with side 1 of the record. First track on the album is The 5-Year Plan. This song starts with a pretty slow tempo build with some really weird production on the drums that is perfectly in line with punk production because honestly it sounds really bad. The tempo increases to a much more familiar punk tempo, like kind of speed, much higher BPM as compared to the intro here, which is kind of a building, plotting intro. This sound definitely falls in line with the kind of sound that would go on to form pizza thrash. God. A side note on pizza thrash, don't listen to it. Like, why? Why would you bother with it? You can really, like, a lot of these younger bands, like, doing, like, this sort of goofy crossover punk thrash or thrash punk that are, like, heavy into, like, the whole, like, pizza thrash thing. If you don't know what pizza thrash, it's like, it's taking thrash metal and like kind of trying to inject fun into it forcibly and without really a care. When a lot of these guys don't realize that you can absolutely be like a complete lunatic on most of these recordings and people will love it even more. And instead it just like comes across as like being like weird for the sake of being weird. There's not a lot of like authenticity in that kind of sound, but that sound is rooted on goddamn D.R.I.'s like crossover album, The 5-Year Plan. Like, this song seems like the blueprint for like most of these really vapid attempts at like a thrash metal band. Hey Jimmy, I think we can write some punk songs here. I got this here drum kit. The point is that a lot of these bands aren't trying to reinvent the wheel. They're just trying to repeat and kind of catch some more of that lightning in a bottle that was that early to mid to late 80s sort of noise of this style of music. and god damn it if it doesn't originate on this record. I could have sworn in a few seconds I was listening to a fucking Municipal Waste record, and don't get me wrong, Municipal Waste is one of the better examples. They have a lot of very good tracks. It just goes to show that 30 years later, you can take like the same goddamn template and release an album, and they sound almost identical, which is I think one of my problems with this kind of sound here, is because it doesn't reward that invention, and thrash is very much stuck in the youthful ignorance of not being able to write a goddamn interesting song. Although, I'll give it to him, the 5-Year Plan is one of the better tracks on this side for sure. Track 2 is Tear It Down. The riff starts off on this song with like a really Kill 'Em All era kind of Metallica sound. The song has some pretty nice double kick here, with some segments that help kind of transition the various tempo changes on this track. The vocals are very much punk rock, and they're kind of on top of the drums in the same way, and it seems like the bass and guitar on this album are really leaning more towards the thrash metal, so it's almost like crossover like thrash punk in that half of the instruments are doing one genre and the other half are doing the other, and in some ways it works, in other ways it doesn't. On this song, I think it is one of the weaker tracks. It's kind of a mess. Like, the songwriting is, it's decent sort of thrash and decent sort of punk, but it's not really like, there's nothing here that stands out as like, holy crap, this is a great track. It's just pretty run-of-the-mill. Track 3 on this thing is A Coffin, a nice building riff that like almost sounds like some early Anthrax stuff. Pumps up this intro for a very, very short song, and it's kind of a track that I wish they would have gone a little bit further into, because it's got this like slow building Anthrax sort of sound into a very, very quick burst of like a punk tempo, and then the song's basically over. It's like probably 30 seconds to a minute long, and it's kind of just a head scratcher as to why it's included in there, because it's one of those songs that's just like not long enough to justify its track listing on this album or on an album. Like, I get a lot of punk songs are like pretty short, and that's what they're doing here, is they're doing like the very traditional like 30 seconds, 40 seconds, minute 30 long punk song, it'll be fine. But it doesn't leave nearly enough time to make anything interesting. It's just kind of a filler track while trying to desperately hide the fact that it's a filler track. Track 4 on this thing is Probation. This track starts with like the most interesting section on the record so far, with a surprisingly competent guitar solo that goes to show that, some punk musicians actually know how to play their fucking instruments. It's got this guitar solo, and then it goes into this like bass heavy groove right at the end of this intro segment into a bit more of that familiar punk tempo, but here it's got like this really nice groovy riff. The song is kind of spaced out with a lot of these bass fills here and there, and the song ends on another surprisingly decent guitar solo. This is definitely one of the stronger songs on this album, as they are actually succeeding in what they're attempting to do with crossing over these two genres in a competent way. It's definitely one of the more interesting songs. The other tracks that have been up until this point had been pretty run-of-the-mill so far, but this song just stands out because the writing here is just a bit of a notch above the other ones. Track 5 is IDKY. This song feels very modern sounding, but that may also be because this genre, like I was saying, is stale as hell and very stagnant. Like, this song specifically, if you put this song and the Municipal Waste song Unholy Abductor like side by side, they sound really goddamn similar. And it's like I was saying, so much of this sound is like very incestuous and not rewarding of like innovation at all. It's just such a clear indicator that not much is going to change for this genre over the next few decades, and it's honestly kind of disappointing when you listen to it. You're like, oh my god, like this is really it, isn't it? Track 6, the final track on side 1 of the record, is Decisions. A really nice subtle kind of phaser effect is used on the guitar here for a pretty nice amount of time, and it's not overdone on this thing, but it's like if you listen close you can kind of hear the light sort of phase switching on the guitar off of this pedal, and it sounds pretty decent, and it kind of builds into this really groove heavy riff that is way more in line with traditional thrash metal and heavy metal than it is punk, and it sounds phenomenal. This track is the best track on this side of the record, and this is definitely the furthest that we get from traditional punk on this album so far. This track is really fun, and like I said, it's probably one of the stronger tracks on the entire record. Thus far, I would definitely say Decisions is probably my favorite so far. We're gonna come back to you after side 2, and we'll go over those and see if we can't find some other gems in this, how do you say, grease pile, or maybe dirt ball, or maybe uninspired pile of crap. Maybe that's a little too harsh. It's okay. It's an album. This is an album. Ugh. Alrighty, so we are back with side 2 of the record. Track number 7 is Hooked. This song predates the original Doom game. However, this record being released in 1987, it does, however, come after the release of Metallica's Master of Puppets. And the reason I bring this up is because the riff that starts off this song sounds like the goddamn riff they use in Doom, which is heavily influenced off of the main riff for Master of Puppets. And I mean, it's not identical, but it is really freaking close. This riff absolutely feels a bit ripped off, but it is well utilized on this song, and this is one of the better songs on this side of the record. Post-Metallica plagiarism, though, the rest of this song is pretty strong and kind of tickling with the idea of like death metal in a few segments. With some of the riffs on this song, they are just like so close into getting into like proto-death metal, although this is the late 80s, so you do kind of get the beginnings of death metal anyway, but like this track, for like a crossover thrash punk album, there's just a weird, like, in this song specifically, twinge of death metal that kind of drips in certain segments. And of course, you could kind of consider most thrash metal as being proto-death metal in a lot of ways, as death metal is kind of the logical conclusion to the heffiness of thrash metal and just amping up that kind of, you know, that animosity and that aggression. And of course that would split into proper like technical death metal and like brutal death metal and all of those. But just this one song just has these really weird twinges of death metal in some of the verses and choruses just here and there. And it's not in the vocals, it's all in the guitar work. It's just really weird. And if you listen close, you can kind of tell what they're going for in this thing. It's still pretty par for the course of this album, but overall not bad. Track 8 on the album is Go Die. Pretty great heavy metal kind of chugging riff opens this track up on this thing. It's fairly promising as the song builds the tempo to a much more thrash focused section on this thing. The Metallica parallels on this thing can once again be drawn through certain segments of this track, mostly for the verses and choruses on this thing again. But the solo on the song makes up for any confusion because it's really excellent. This is a pretty strong track. It's not one of the best ones, but it is one of the better ones on this side for sure. Track 9 is Redline. Pretty standard, slow-paced chugging once again starts off this song, and it starts getting a bit formulaic at this point, as the album at this point has quite a few of these tracks that start with the slow sort of thrash chugging that builds for a very short, like maybe 20-second period into the very punky segments of this album. So the formula is starting to get kind of obvious at this point and a little bit tired, but overall this song, I mean, it's fun. The themes are pretty fun, like the red line, like sort of, you know, pumping and driving, you know, very high speeds, but it's just like, it's sort of starting to overstay its welcome at this point. While this song is decent overall, it just seems that like so much of this album is very cut and dry, going through the motions, with like a good track in here and there to kind of keep the pacing okay, and I can't disagree with that, because at least they're sort of keeping your interest by sort of like dispersing these other more traditional punk kind of thrash tracks in with these more thrash metal influenced tracks as well. It's not terrible, it just ends up kind of like coming across as like, well, maybe we could have spent a little bit more time on some of these other tracks. Track 10 on the album is No Religion. Some bells tolling kick off this song with a really nice building riff, with some really nice bass tracks on this thing that takes the initial focus and then kind of slingshots back the guitar to kick up the tempo, and they do this a couple of times throughout this track, and it works pretty well whenever they do that on this thing. This track overall it's pretty decent. I mean, I kind of give this as like kind of a take it or leave it track. Like, it's really not bad, but it's just kind of falls once in line with the stuff I was talking about earlier of just kind of like just pacing itself out enough to kind of keep your interest. Track 11 is Fun and Games. This song really does not spend too much time dicking around, and offers one of my favorite groovy sections on this entire album, with this really like strong sort of mosh pit anthem kind of sound in this thing. And I am glad in a lot of ways for the pacing of this record, because this song right here towards the end of the album is really strong. This is probably, in my opinion, one of my favorite songs on the record, be it side A or side B. The styles of thrash metal and punk really blend well here, and they shift like from segment to segment really well, with some of like these slower kind of mosh heavy segments into some of the higher tempo ones, but it kind of breaks the earlier formula just enough for it to remain fresh. If the song was a little bit longer, I think this song would probably be the best song on the whole record. But the track itself itself is kind of short, so it kind of leaves a little bit left to be desired, which isn't too much of a big deal because the final track on this album, track 12, Oblivion, definitely kicks back up some of those heavy metal and thrash metal elements to a really, really nice high. This track opens up with like a lot of like sort of hectic city noises and traffic kind of noises with like these klaxon sirens going off in the background. And this song is by far one of the heaviest songs on the record. This is like the most pure thrash that you're gonna get on this album here. Like this song would probably be well at home on like a Nuclear Assault record. The themes of nuclear annihilation make for a great setting for this song, and it just really pulls the album to a nice strong close, with some of the songs on this record being a little weak in certain segments. As long as they finished this thing off with a good track, I think it was all kind of worth it. You know, it's hard to write a really perfect album, and I think D.R.I. did a really good attempt here, and they were trying certainly a lot of stuff. I mean, this being one of the earliest examples of crossover thrash and punk, I definitely think this attempt was pretty admirable. Overall, I've really never been the biggest fan of most punk bands and even a lot of thrash metal bands, because I think a lot of the effort on a lot of these projects is wasted a little bit with just the limitations of these genres and just what you're writing for and the audience you're writing for. Most of these thrash fans and most punk fans really don't want too much different, and if you go too far out into the boundaries of what your genre can do, you eventually kind of tread into a different genre, usually a more interesting genre than thrash or punk. But I think that the good thrash and punk albums that already exist are, you know, have had this staying power because they've been quite good. I think the reason D.R.I. is probably not more well recognized is just because they're kind of like an average band in a lot of ways. Like, this album does a lot of things that have just been repeated to death, and at the time they did them, they were already kind of old ideas. I mean, the biggest bands to come out of this era were not punk bands for the most part. I mean, and if they were punk bands, their longevity was not assured. Like, this is not one of those bands that has stood the test of time and is really kind of, I would say, a cultural footnote in this sort of style of crossover and thrash metal and punk. Of course, you get like a lot of contemporary bands nowadays. Like I was saying, Municipal Waste is definitely, I would say, one of the modern bands that you could draw the most parallels between this album and their material. You get like Lich King. I mean, their EP Do-Over rips off this album cover intentionally and in a pretty tasteful way, and mostly for comedic purposes. But most of these modern thrash acts are closer to the sort of sound of crossover than to pure thrash metal or to pure punk. Like, most of these guys are going off of the crossover sound, which just evolved into that sort of pizza thrash sound, which I really, really dislike in a lot of ways. But overall, this album's pretty decent. If you've listened to this album, leave your opinion in the comments. I'd love to read it. If you haven't listened to this album, go ahead and check it out. It's not bad. I mean, there's some good highlights on this record. There's some kind of lower points where the songwriting gets a little bit stale, but I think just for like historical purposes, this is an album that you should probably listen to just to kind of say you have. Other than that, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you on Thursday.